Welcome everyone to this webinar presented by the Australian Fungicide Resistance Extension Network, also known as AFREN. My name is Bridget Penner. I work for Ag Communicators, and we're one of the companies involved with AFREN, which is a network of plant pathologists, fungicide resistance experts, and communication and extension providers. So AFREN's role is to develop and deliver fungicide resistance resources for growers and advisors across Australia. In today's session, we're pleased to have Nick Poole, Managing Director of FAR Australia, and Darcy Warren, Senior Research Manager from FAR Australia, to present. So before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions as Nick and Darcy are presenting, please use the Q&A box. You'll find a button at the bottom of your screen. We've had a few questions come through the registration process, so after Nick and Darcy have presented, they'll look to answer some of those, plus any questions that have come through. Also, at the end of the webinar, we have a short survey that we'll post a link to in the chat. So we're really looking to continually improve the resources that we deliver for the grain industry. So your feedback is really helpful to help shape the communications. All right, without any further ado, I will hand over to Nick and Darcy. Thanks.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. As Bridget's just said, this is part of a AFREN webinar series, and what we'd like to do is, between us, talk through some key things about effective fungicide use. We've put a title, though, that says effective use of fungicides. Can we use less so they last longer? Because obviously fungicide resistance and reduced sensitivity erodes our ability to use them in the future. So where do we sit with regards resistance? And we probably first and foremost need to be aware of that. 20 years ago, we had one of the largest cases of fungicide resistance anywhere in the world. And you can see the blue dot on your screen here, where we had a problem with barley powdery mildew in WA. Over the last 20 years, the situation has changed considerably, such that we have many more pathogens now that are actually causing us issues. Is the sky falling in? Probably not, but it's important to note, particularly with regards to net blotch that Darcy will talk about later, to realise that in some cases, our fungicide strategies are failing in the field to give us the kind of control that we might have expected 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I think the other aspect with this is to actually recognise that fungicides are our last line of defence. And so in trying to retain effective fungicides for the future, we're constantly talking about trying to look at those other measures, the IDM measures, the integrated disease management measures that can help us in that respect. And probably before one ever considers a fungicide, remember that if we use less fungicide, then we're more sustainable for the future. In fact, frequency of fungicide use is a key driver towards them being less effective. So first and foremost, try and make sure that our variety selection gives us a good solid foundation and reduces our disease pressure in the first place. The second thing is look at your rotation. Have you got a rotation that actually gives you some protection? Is your stubble in a susceptible variety? Because that's going to feed into the following season. And again, Darcy will show you some evidence of that. So when it comes to those fungicides, remember they're the last line of defense, and we only really want to apply them when they're necessary, and we need to apply them strategically, and we will come back to that. If you remember nothing else this afternoon, effectively remember the fungicide resistance 5. They're key to helping us combat disease, and part of those, again, starts with other measures. So let's look at them. These aren't rocket science. You've heard them many, many times before. So the fungicide resistance 5 avoid very susceptible varieties. Why? Because you'll be inundated with disease in the seasons that have good yield potential, and you've actually got the rainfall to actually achieve very much higher yields than normal. But with lots of disease, you'll have to start your fungicide program earlier, and it's highly likely you're going to apply that many more applications. So try and avoid those very susceptible cultivars, or growing them in circumstances where they're going to give you more pressure. What do I mean by that? If you sow early, it's invariable that invariably you'll get more disease cycles during the growing season. So wherever you can, look at reducing your disease pressure and the amount of inoculum. Perhaps it might be through grazing if you're looking at having a livestock enterprise that grazes your cereals. Think about the strategic management of your stubble previously. On occasions, a strategic burn or a strategic cultivation may well be necessary. But when it comes to the fungicides, we're going to talk about this aspect of when to use them to make them effective and how to use them, mixing what modes of action we've got together so that we kill the fungus by more than just one route. Okay, so what have we actually got to combat disease when it comes to fungicides? Well, anywhere that you go, anywhere in the world, the answer is probably going to be the same. And that is that unlike herbicides, we really only have three principal modes of action in our broad acre fungicide armory. And those three modes of action are represented in these next slides. First of all, we have the group 3 DMIs, as we call them, demethylation inhibitors. We've used these products for getting on now for 50 years and more. They were a revolution in their time because they were the first of those systemic fungicides that enabled us to actually get some activity inside the leaf tissue. We've used these products, like I say, in Australia here, probably for the last 25 years, and their price has declined considerably over that period. So the group 3 DMIs are the backbone of disease management strategies. But the last 25 years, 30 years in some cases, have seen the development of some really effective fungicides that are effective at very low concentrations. The first mode of action in this group are the strobilurins, or the QOIs, quinine outside inhibitors. We only have two in broadacre cereals. These are azoxystrobin and pyraclostrobin, but they're provided to us in the main in mixtures with DMIs. So we have two modes of action combating most of the foliar diseases. And when these strobilurins were introduced in Europe in the mid-90s, they really were a revolution, because for the first time we saw these enhanced greening effects from controlling disease at stages we hadn't previously been able to control it. The next group is a group that's been around for a number of years, but since about 2010, we've had access globally to a new branch of that family, and that's the SDHIs. And the SDHIs are effectively a new super duper protectant fungicide with perhaps slightly better curative activity than we might see in the strobilurins. They're available to us now as either very effective seed-borne treatments like Vibrance and Evergold, sorry, mixing my actives and my brand names, but Vibrance, Evergold, examples of these very effective seed-borne SDHIs. But we also have products that are used in the foliars market, like Bixafen, that comes to us mixed with prothioconazole in Aviator Expert. So the SDHIs have been a very effective addition to our foliar armory. That's what we've got, and we've had a question through on the panel basically saying, have we got anything new coming through? And the answer is there's not a lot on the horizon, certainly in terms of agrochemical fungicides. We're very fortunate in Australia that we've just, in this last year or so, had access to some fungicides with special permits through APVMA. Let's look at these. These new permitted mildewicides have actually been incredibly important, because powdery mildew is a very, very difficult disease to control. And so we've now got access to 3 products. They're expensive, but if we did want to protect ourselves against mildew, these will be an important addition to the armory, available through this season and next season. In the future, but not yet approved, are the QIIs. And from what we've seen so far in Europe and under testing here, these will be important additions to the armory against diseases such as Septoria triticide blotch. So, looking at fungicides themselves, how to get effective use of them, we probably need to know that they are essentially protectants. They work best on the leaves present at the time of spraying. Why? Well, for one, if you're dealing with a systemic fungicide, and all of the DMIs we use are systemic, they actually only move in one direction, to the leaf tip. So if you've got a leaf that's part of merged, the material, once getting inside the tissue, won't move back down the leaf. And that's important to recognize. The other aspect is that people talk about curative activity. This is when you're trying with a fungicide to cure disease that might have already germinated. You can't see it, so it's in the latent phase, and you're trying to clean that out before it expresses. This is extremely difficult to get any timings that are absolutely perfect, as you would imagine, particularly if you have multiple infection periods. So that curative activity is probably best thought of at best at 7 to 10 days. But in some cases, yellow leaf spot, powdery mildew, the latent phase or the hidden phase of development of the disease is so short, you're best just to think of fungicides against those diseases as being almost purely protectant. So when it comes to looking at the most effective way to use a fungicide, remember it's trying to determine which leaves or which part of the plant are the most important to protect. Remembering that your best protection will be provided on those leaves before they show appreciable infection. Some fungicides, such as the strobilurins, and we have 2 of these molecules, azoxystrobin and pyraclostrobin, these 2 molecules are in effect, along with the strobes generally, super protectants. Although sometimes the material might get inside the leaf, as is the case with azoxystrobin, you actually find that it's their activity on the leaf surface that is most important. So the strobes, good examples of something that's essentially a protectant. Okay, let's have a look at the scenario then of why we apply fungicides in the first place. And it's easy to say we apply them to control disease, But actually, if you're a practicing farmer, you apply fungicides to make money, not control disease, because you may have disease in a crop of cereals from the 2-leaf stage. But short of keeping a cloud of fungicide over the entire paddock for the entire season, that's probably not an effective way to use them. So the key question becomes, at what stage or what parts of the plant do you want to protect? And in order to do that, you really need to think about both the disease and the plant, and try and look at both the epidemiology of the disease and then what are the most important parts of the plant to express a benefit from the fungicide for controlling that disease. And in cereals, it's these top 4 leaves. We call those top 4 leaves the money leaves. Why? Because they're the ones that essentially are associated with filling the grain or the seed or the pod if you're growing a broadleaf crop and harvesting the seed from those pods. They're associated with the profitability, for want of a better description. They are the route to effective use of a fungicide. In cereals, they are the top 4 leaves. And whilst the stem and the head are important as well, most fungicide strategies in cereals to be effective has to combat disease in the period when these leaves are emerging. And so what you see with the diagram here is that the 2 lower leaves, what we refer to as flag -2 and flag -3, are effectively the less important of those leaves than the flag and flag -1. However, sometimes with the environments we have in Australia, these 2 important leaves are able to look after themselves, by which I mean the environment tends to dry, become hotter, and disease expression on these leaves is restricted. And this is particularly the case in low rainfall regions. So sometimes we may be applying fungicides to these lower leaves, F-2 and F-3, but actually not need either as much fungicide or a fungicide at all on the upper leaves. Important to recognize that when it comes to strategies, most fungicide strategies for cereals will revolve around timings that look to apply fungicide to these leaves when they emerge. And these are the approximate nodal growth stages when these leaves are emerging. Okay, that sets the scene for some of the dynamics of how and when to use those fungicides. What we're now going to do is to look at a little bit more detail around strategy. And so I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Darcy Warren to take you through effectively disease management in barley. Over to you, Darcy.
Thank you very much, Nick. So I guess in hindsight, in putting these slides together, I've probably gone in the opposite order than what I should have, because I'm going to start off by talking about the typical timings that we normally apply fungicides in our barley crops. But if we think back to that diagram Nick put up on the 3rd slide, fungicides are really our last line of defense. And before we get to this stage, we're really needing to be weighing up those other factors that influence our disease risk. And where possible, limit the amount of fungicides that we're using. So when we're putting these slides together in preparation for this presentation, we're actually reminiscing about some trials that we were running back in 2020, where we were looking at RGT Planet at our site in Victoria. And a lot of the conversation around that time was or do we need a 2-spray program to manage the disease in our barley? We knew Planet back then was still fairly susceptible, so it was rated S back then rather than SPS as it is now. And we're asking questions like, where do we use our SDHIs to get best bang for buck? And sort of in reminiscing, it's interesting how times have changed. But if we look at our longer season environment, we're still ideally looking using a 2-spray program in conjunction with those integrated disease management strategies. And as Nick was just saying, in our longer season HRZ environments where we know we'll be likely applying fungicides, it's important to know what leaves to protect. So in barley, we class this as our growth stage 39 to 49 timing. So barley is a little bit different to wheat, and flag leaf, protecting the flag leaf is not the most important leaf, whereas the flag -1 and the flag sheath become more important to protect with our fungicides because they contribute more to yield. So when we're planning out our fungicide strategy, this should be the timing that we're looking at protecting, because this is our money leaves, and then work backwards from that point of the season, taking care to mind the gap. So not having more than a 3 to 4 week gap in our fungicide timings, and working back, likely to be around that early stem elongation phase when the first of our money leaves are starting to emerge. If we have a look at a shorter season environment, ideally, we would be looking at maybe a single spray program to protect our leaves from disease. So historically, we may have been able to get away with a seed treatment getting us through the season, but for reasons we'll sort of touch on a bit later, those strategies are maybe a thing of the past or probably less effective than they have been previously. But even in the low and medium rainfall zones, it will become really important to still protect those money leaves in seasons where we do have high yield potential, and we do have more rainfall and disease risk is higher. So even if we are originally looking at a 1-spray program, maybe earlier in the season at early stem elongation, it still pays to have flexibility around that growth stage 39 to 49 timing, where if the season, as it often does, turns drier and disease doesn't develop, we can leave a fungicide off. But if we do have that yield potential continuing and disease moving up the canopy, we can consider that timing. So ones if we throw a curveball into that scenario and probably address a bit of the elephant in the room. So probably since that 2020 stage when we were running that trial in Narwarri, Southwest Victoria, the biggest disease we've been talking about since then is net form of net blotch. And just recently, the labs at CCDM have confirmed that net form net blotch isolates have resistance to all 3 modes of actions that we have registered for controlling that disease. So our SDHIs, our DMIs, and our strobes. So we're still finding out how widespread this is in our environment. But in terms of management, it just means that potentially we cannot rely on our fungicides to be controlling the disease for us. Instead, as an industry, we need to work on reducing the spread of this triple mutant strain and look at those integrated disease management strategies to stop that spread. So utilizing more resistant varieties, controlling the green bridge, controlling inoculum in stubble, clean seed sources and crop rotation. And that's essentially what we've been seeing on site. So these are some results from our Victorian site. So FAR is involved with the Program 5 GRDC funded project, the Program 5 Integrated Disease Management Strategies for Net Form of Net Blotch. And these are some of our results from the last couple of years. So you can see here that we've got our treatment list on the right, and we're looking at a lot of different combinations of our 3 different modes of actions at different timings throughout the season, focusing on those key money leaf growth stages. And you can see here that the best results, and these are disease severity scores taken from early grain fill. And you can see here that we are still getting some control from our fungicides, and these are coming from the treatments where we have multiple modes of action at multiple different timings. And in this trial, we have up to 4 units of fungicide in the season. But even with these robust fungicide managements, we're still only seeing 60 to 75% control with those 4 units. And yeah, we've come a long way since that 2020 trial where we're getting more like 80 or 90% control with a 2 fungicide program. So what can we do about this? And I guess the other aspect of one of the other aspects we're looking at in this project is paddock hygiene. So we're running some large plot work where we're looking at 3 different stubble managements. So stubble standing, cultivating the stubble, and then burning the stubble away, and then growing these plots with and without fungicide. So this year, we've sown neo barley into planet stubble. And just this week, I've done an assessment looking at the net form infection on the different leaf layers that are currently emerged. So it's currently at growth stage 31. And I recognize that in this graph, our disease levels don't look massive. They're all under 10%. But considering this is a neo crop that we know can get net form and net blotch, but probably isn't too bad, as we'll see on the next slide. It was early June sown, and it's only at growth stage 31. In a normal scenario, not sown into barley stubble, I'd expect no disease to be in this paddock. Yet we're getting these differences where we've reduced our inoculum load in the paddock with cultivating or burnt, we're getting these statistical reductions in infection. So one of the questions that we got before the webinar today was asking about what do we do in our systems where we've got high disease pressure, and in terms of rotation and profitability, we're forced to grow a lot more barley. And so essentially, well, first and foremost, in these scenarios, we're going to be needing to grow really robust varieties with good disease packages, but then also be considering the inoculum levels in our environment. So this picture I have here is a really extreme example of a couple of years ago when we had a really wet harvest. At the back of our little plot header, we had, we're harvesting some of our net form trials. So we had infected seed coming out of the back of the header. Because it was wet, it was germinating out of the infected stubble. And so not even at the tiller and growth stage, we already had very high severity in this crop. So really important to remember that net form is a seed and stubble-borne disease. So anything we can do to reduce the stubble load or the inoculum load in our environment will go a long way. But I've probably left the best till last. So one of the most important strategies we can use for integrated disease management is using varietal resistance to the disease. So also part of the Program 5 project, we're looking at a series of varieties with different resistance ratings to net form and net blotch. And as I mentioned before, the Neo, which is currently rated MS to net form and net blotch, compared to the varieties that are SVS, there's quite a stark contrast there between the level of infection that we're getting. So this graph up here is some of the work that we're doing in our germplasm evaluation network, where we're growing new and upcoming varieties plus and minus fungicide. And what we're trying to find in these trials here are varieties that give very little response to fungicide. So the difference between these bars is hopefully as little as possible, because that means they're not getting disease in them. You may look at Planet in this graph and say, oh, the difference between the untreated and plus fungicide isn't that great, even compared to some of the other varieties you say are all right. But I think in reality here, these were grown with a 2-foliar fungicide program, and we weren't actually controlling the disease even with fungicides for Planet in this trial. My last point I'll touch on is moving to new varieties may come with a bit of a caveat. So we're already seeing a bit of a shift away from these more net form susceptible varieties. And this year we're already seeing a lot more variety in the disease on site. So we're seeing a lot more scald and leaf rust come in as we shift our focus from the varieties that are susceptible to net form. We need to be conscious of the other diseases coming in. So from Western Australia across to Victoria and even down to Tasmania, I've been seeing a lot more scald this year. And the rain that we're currently getting down here in Victoria is probably going to help its cause as well. So just keep an eye out for those other diseases too. So I'll pass back to Nick now to talk about some strategies for wheat.
Thanks, Darcy. So one of the key things that Darcy's brought forward there is the fact that we see different diseases in different regions with different prominence. And I suppose that's the starting point for any strategy that you're trying to devise to protect your crops. And that's the fact that you need some evidence locally that fungicides are profitable. And that's why we set up Gen to actually look at this aspect of what is the yield gap between plus and minus fungicide. And we've now been working on this for 3 years, and we're beginning to see some patterns that are being generated. And I thought I'd share one of those patterns that I particularly have found interesting, that you may have heard me talk of before. And that is that effectively, just a tick, effectively, when you look at fungicide strategies that we've been engaging in the West compared to the East, we're finding a profound difference in the level of response that we're getting in wheat. And I put this 2024 example up. We have similar data from 2023 and earlier years. But why I put this piece of data in front of you is that you can actually see the yield levels between the high rainfall zone, or wasn't so high rainfall in 2024, down here in southern Victoria in Nuwari. So this is traditionally an area of the country that would easily grow 8 to 10 tons given a good season. Last year was dreadful. We were seeing crops at 4 and 5 ton. That matched quite neatly. In fact, Franklin River had more growing season rainfall. But I think if you look at the difference between the untreated bars and the 3 spray fungicide strategies, because both trials had 3 sprays of fungicide, some interesting differences really start to show up. There's very little response in most cases in the West, and in fact we can get no statistical significance to show between treated and untreated in that trial as an average across all of those varieties. However, when you look at the situation at Nuwari here in the East, the situation is completely different. So look for some local sources of information that say fungicides are paying for me, because this has quite shocked us in terms of the difference in responsiveness between wheat crops in the west currently and the east. And I've used Franklin River, but I could have equally used our Esperance port zone data. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is very simple. In the eastern states currently, we're confronted with two diseases that aren't there in commercial crops in the west. I'm sure in a remote corner somewhere, somebody will be able to find the spores for both. But stripe rust and Septoria triticide blotch are not part of the WA landscape. And whilst other diseases such as Staganospora, wheat powdery mildew, yellow leaf spot are part of the WA scenario, we're not seeing the same level of response to controlling those diseases that we are from controlling stripe rust and Septoria. But actually, over these last two drier years, and we're hoping this one's going to be different, 2025, it's raining outside at the moment, which is good news. What we've seen is that in the drier years, whilst you can have a lot of Septoria triticide blotch at the start of the season, up to the start of stem elongation, for the disease to really cause you trouble, it has to be wet following your sort of first application timings at the start of stem elongation in order for this disease to be problematic by the time you get to flag leaf. So over the last 2 years, Septoria triticide has started out with an inoculum base, but it's never really developed. In contrast, stripe rust has been totally different. So stripe rust is robbing us of yield in seasons like 22, where we got at our Wallenbean site, in data that you may well have seen before, we were getting a 6 tonne a hectare response in Septor from 4 units of fungicide compared to the untreated crop. That doesn't happen very often. But what surprised us more is it's these drier years that we're still getting responses in susceptible varieties when they're susceptible to stripe rust. So stripe rust is robbing us of yield in very good years and much poorer years. So bear that difference in mind and have a local source of information available to you when you're making decisions on strategies, because it's important to have data that shows something's paying in a particular region. If we take susceptible varieties, particularly stripe rust susceptible varieties in the east right now, in most cases, you could look at a strategy that might look something like this. If you apply a fungicide for stripe rust at the start of stem elongation, say growth stage 31, 32, when the crop has 1 to 2 nodes, the leaves there present at that time, tip of F-2, F-3, applications of fungicide applied then effectively give good control of disease that's been brewing up to the start of stem elongation through the late tiller phase. But what you don't have in those susceptible scenarios, because of the way in which fungicides work, as we illustrated earlier, whilst you dampen the disease down in that paddock, you don't directly put any fungicide on the 2 upper most important leaves. In a drier environment, that might not be important for diseases such as Septoria. But if you don't control rust, then it could still be problematic. And what you see in this diagram is that illustration in a schematic where those 2 top leaves are coloured green to show you that they're not covered with the fungicide you applied at 31, 32. But most importantly, and a point that Darcy made earlier, is mind the gap. Because sometimes it's easy to think that you're doing a really, really good job and you're combating disease very early and you spray much earlier with your first spray. But in effect, what can happen in those circumstances is if your next spray isn't until flag leaf, the number of leaves unprotected and their money leaves are greater, because late tiller in growth stage 30 doesn't put fungicide on F-2 or F-3 because they haven't emerged. Then you say, well, actually, I'll put one on in 3 to 4 weeks. And this is where the number of fungicide applications starts to increase. So that if you're not careful, by the time you get to flag leaf, your flag leaf spray is your third spray. So when it comes to stripe rust susceptible varieties, and you're going to continue to grow those stripe rust susceptible varieties, then it's really important to think about flutriafol as an at-sowing measure that gives you stripe rust control, which is one of those few diseases where if it gets hold and takes hold in the late tiller early stem elongation phase before your 31 spray, it can still rob you of a little yield. It won't be much because it's still important to protect those money leaves. But for very susceptible varieties, it represents a choice you can make there. And on occasions, if you're in a very bad powdery mildew scenario, the same could apply, that you could look at flutriafol as a start point. Why? Because that fungicide is feeding through the plant from the roots using the xylem stream or the water carrying vessel stream to take fungicide through the plant. When it dissipates is usually around the start of that stem elongation phase, maybe perhaps a bit longer in the lower rainfall areas where the season is more truncated. But this mind the gap was incredibly important in 2022 and remains a key part to look at, because if you start very early and then you do get really conducive conditions for disease following that first application, you could well think you're very well covered when in fact all of your money leaves are unprotected. And as it was said to me a long time ago, that's like leaving your Rolls Royce out with no coat of paint on it. So bear that one in mind, because that one always struck me as a good one. Okay, but we're not all in a scenario of high rainfall zone and susceptibility. And although stripe rust is different, it seems to affect us in dry and wet years. For a lot of blotch diseases that require rainfall, like Septoria tritici, it's actually the dry that actually acts as a fungicide. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the typical environment, say in the low rainfall zone, you can start off with disease at the beginning of the season. You might have some septoria, you might have perhaps some powdery mildew, and then the environment just dries out through warmer temperatures, through lack of rainfall. And the blue triangle on this slide is to represent an environment that has less humidity and as a consequence less disease, which means that your second fungicide that you might have to apply in high risk scenarios that Darcy was explaining for barley starts to become less important. Not because the flag leaf is less important, but actually because it's being looked after by the environment and doesn't perhaps need either as much fungicide or any fungicide to support it. So, in other words, dry weather is a very, very effective fungicide. It's just we don't always want it. So bear in mind this flexibility in these low and medium rainfall zones as to whether you have to apply a second spray or not. And if it's been very wet following your first spray, or it's been softer in terms of temperature, then that's a signal in those 3 to 4 weeks in that gap period to be monitoring very, very strongly. So I think when it comes then to wheat strategies per se, the key points, you're applying fungicides based on economics. You want to make money. Protecting the money leaves is really a no-brainer for most foliar disease that you'll encounter. Unless, of course, you're in an environment where drier weather is already protecting them. Once you've got the profit of your strategy worked out and you feel that you've got the timings right for what you're going to do, think then about resistance management. Can you actually reduce your risk of resistance developing or reduce sensitivity, making sure you're not just repeating the same active ingredients, either epoxyconazole followed by epoxyconazole, or as happens a lot in lower rainfall environments, propiconazole followed by propiconazole, and then do the same the following year. Think about whether you can ring the changes, and with cheaper fungicides more generally, that should be possible. Remember, IDM principles actually can help us delay our fungicide start. So what does that mean? It ultimately means we put fewer fungicides on. If we could start our fungicide program later with more resistant varieties and a better environment, we can see more further into the future. In other words, we've got better prospects of knowing what the season's going to be like. And the other last point is that in wheat, if you could delay, and we used to, delay our fungicides because we had resistance against disease until flagleaf, or your flutriafol lasts you through until flagleaf, then it's actually arguable that a foliar fungicide applied at flag means you protect all of those money leaves at the same time. So 4 lines in the sand doesn't mean you have to spray at those 4 key timings, but they're the timings to consider. Do you need something up front? Flutriafol being an excellent example for things such as stripe rust, or possibly for mildew, powdery mildew, if you've got evidence that it's still effective in your region. Then growth stage 31, growth stage 39, so first node, flagleaf, and head emergence, not flowering, head emergence, key times to think of a fungicide. In most cases, 2 foliar fungicides will be adequate for scenarios in Australia, but in really good seasons, in the high rainfall zone, a 3rd fungicide, particularly where it's longer season, may well be needed to protect the head and to give you what we call a flagleaf topper. In WA right now, I think there's more flexibility with timing because you don't always have that stripe rust pressure early. And that stripe rust pressure early is something that can't be ignored, or septoria triticide if you've got high pressure. But if in WA you don't have that pressure, make sure you know what you're spraying for and make sure it is disease. As one of the things that AFREN has tried to promote is that a lot of fungicide spraying is conducted on crops where it's not actually disease that are the symptoms. So I think that gives a really good foundation. And what we'll do now is, between us, in the time we've got left, handle some of the questions. So I don't know, Darcy, would you like to perhaps start? We've had a few questions, like we say, that have come in beforehand.
Yeah, so I'll kick off with one of those early questions, and So the one that came in was around the increased use of Prosaro in the south. So Prosaro being prothioconazole and tebuconazole, a mix of two DMIs, and where the highest risk of resistance is in that chemistry. And I think to answer that, it's probably best just to go back to, I think it was your second slide, wasn't it, Nick? And just have a look at that map of fungicide resistance. And just obviously, as I talked about in net form and net blotch in barley, obviously a very high risk there with the triple mutant. But anywhere in this list where you see a group 3 or the DMI is highlighted, but like particularly your wheat powdery mildew, your septoria, your net blotches, that's where those, I guess, those more risky diseases will be for that chemistry.
And I think one of the things just add in there that I didn't say, Darcy, was that actually this list is slightly out of date already, because you may have heard that actually the group 7 STHIs have actually not been as effective in parts of South Australia, where they've now diagnosed that the blackleg pathogen has started to overcome the STHIs. So this is an ever-changing field. We also noticed that we've had a question about stem rust infection in the medium and low rainfall. What action would one take? And I think that's a really interesting one. We don't see this disease very often, but when we do see it, it can be very debilitating. I think the most important thing to recognize is that just when you've put the sprayer away for the season, this disease can actually bite you very late in the season. So in work that we've done previously and papers that have been produced from, say, 25 years ago will tell you that actually it's usually timings in that flag leaf to head emergence phase that can be very much more effective on stem rust. And if you do want information on product choice for stem rust, then GRDC funded for Australia back in 2010, 2011 and 2012. So there is data on the fungicides active ingredients that you can access. Over to you.
Yeah, well, I guess maybe I'll go back to some of the other questions we got a bit earlier on. And we had a question that sort of relates to in terms of resistance, was how agronomists can help researchers and industry have good local knowledge of regional resistant issues. And I think that's a really good point, because agronomists are essentially at the forefront and are looking at the crops most closest. But I think from my point of view, firstly, the role that agronomists could play in that is, first of all, gathering the context for what they think they're seeing in the paddock. And probably firstly being, if you can rule out essentially were there any issues with the actual spray, the timing, water rate, chemical rate that might have caused unusual activity with disease in the paddocks. That first of all is really useful. But then when an issue is identified, sending samples off for testing, I think, is probably the best way to notify the rest of the industry. So sending samples to CCDM or sending samples to the Rust survey, any of those sort of courses of actions are really helpful in mapping where these issues are occurring, and then assisting with what managements can then happen.
We've had some interesting questions that have also come in whilst we've been speaking, and one that is very often asked is, it's easy to say don't spray, unless it's necessary when you've got disease building in the crop on the lower leaves. So is there not a case for actually spraying earlier than the suggested timings around stem elongation, just from a practical logistics aspect of keeping the spore pressure lower? And this is where I think that the use of at sowing measures, if you haven't got the germplasm, but it's so important to recognize this is where the germplasm should be providing the protection until those money leaves. And this issue very often is the case whereby we have a situation where we spray earlier and earlier and earlier. And this happened with powdery mildew in the 2020 season, because people had powdery mildew at the 4-leaf stage, were spraying for it, then realized that the powdery mildew wasn't going away, sprayed for it again. So it actually sprayed by the time they got to head emergence 5 times, because they're going earlier and earlier. And this is where this aspect of fungicides protect what they hit. And whilst in some cases one can go back to growth stage 30, sort of that very early stage of stem elongation, and warrant a spray, it's a law of diminishing returns going back further than that. And that's when those in-furrow options become more important. Darcy, I think we've got, what, three or so minutes left. Did you have some other questions that you wanted to?
Yeah, we had another question about, and it's not something that we covered in our presentation today, but the use of adjuvants and surfactants to improve performance and efficacy of our fungicides. So I think in general, we do see really good results from the addition of these products in improving our fungicides. And generally speaking, anything that we can do to improve the coverage of our fungicides on those target leaves, including water rate, but anything we can do to improve that coverage will assist the fungicide in doing the best job that it can. In terms of getting more information about those things, though, in the development phase of all our fungicide products, there's a lot of investment and work that goes into this by the manufacturers of the fungicides. I guess it logically makes sense that they want their products to do the best. And so I think following the label or going to those manufacturers, they're going to have the best information for their products and what to use with them.
We're running out of time, and we've got plenty of questions coming in and still here to answer. But there was some questions around curative activity, and hopefully we've tried to say, well, curative activity will always be limited with fungicides, because you're trying to control the disease in a very, very tight window, i.e., whilst it's developing in the leaf. And with some diseases, that's just not going to be possible. But for other diseases, perhaps stripe rust or septoria, yes, we do have curative activity. And I think really importantly, for diseases like stripe rust, we still have a very effective armory. And there were some questions around, well, what's working? And DMIs such as epoxyconazole are still very strong rust materials, particularly for stripe rust in the curative phase. But don't over egg it, because it's still not a very long period that we're talking about. Diseases coming down from the north. We talked about stem rust earlier. Our experiences in the eastern state is that it can come down from further north where it warms up quicker. By this time in previous years, we've usually had a lot of early warning of stripe rust to the north of us. That's been less so this season. But this season, if we are experiencing wet weather and we've put our first spray on, don't dismiss Septoria tritici, because it's got a long latent period, remains hidden for a long time. But if it's been very wet and you had that inoculum in the base, highly unlikely that your first fungicide would have taken it all out of the system. So think about that one. I think that's, Bridget, all we've got time to answer in the webinar, but we will try to answer other questions you have if you've left them with Bridget. So back to you, Bridget.
Thank you so much, Nick and Darcy. That was great. Really a lot of information and really useful. Thank you. Just a reminder that I've shared a link to the post-webinar survey in the chat box. So if you could complete that, that would be much appreciated. And if you're looking for any other resources on fungicide resistance, head to afren.com.au. Thanks, everyone.